What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Fed Up Church. I'm Pastor Sean Finney, the neuroscience guy who got sick and tired of churches, preaching crap wrong, teaching things that weren't in the Bible, and ignoring science. So this week we're digging into the science of Genesis Part 2. And part of that's going to require us to dig into what is radiocarbon dating, getting a scientific understanding of that, finding out if dragons are real, can they or could they breathe fire, and how do we determine the age of things to say that a dinosaur is 500 million years old? And what's any of this have to do with the Bible? So, if you're like me and you're a Christian and you don't want to deny science, at the same time you want to follow where the evidence actually leads, then stick around and let's learn a little bit more about what God has to say in the Bible and what he has to say in your science textbook. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and pick up in Ezekiel Chapter 37. I'll be reading from the New International Version as well as the King James Version to get an understanding of where we get a lot of our current ideas and understandings of the Bible, how things get misinterpreted and misappropriated and misapplied and then just taught wrong. Okay, Ezekiel chapter 37. NIV, it says, "The hand of the Lord was on me, and he brought me out of the spirit of the Lord and set me in the middle of the valley. It was full of bones. He led me back and forth among them, and I saw a great many bones on the floor of the valley, bones that were very dry. He asked me, 'Son of man, can these bones live?' I said, 'Sovereign Lord, you alone know.'" In verse 4, it says, "Then he said to me, 'Prophesy to these bones and say to them, dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the Sovereign Lord says to these bones. I will make breath enter you. You will come to life. I will attach tendons to you and make flesh come upon you and cover you with skin. I will put breath in you and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am the Lord.'" What does any of this have to do with the science of Genesis? Let's find out. So today I want to take a minute or 60, however long this takes, to dig deeper into a topic that I discussed briefly a few weeks ago. And that was radiocarbon dating. Bones, specifically, like fossils. How do we know how old they are? And is any of it valid? For those of you who may not be aware, radiocarbon dating, or C14 dating, is a method by which we determine the age of something based upon how much carbon-14 exists in any organic specimen. It's the most reliable method we have for dating organic material. Keep that in mind. And organic, for the uninitiated, organic simply means something that contains carbon-14. Now, it is based on the fact that radiocarbon, or C14 as we'll shorten it, is constantly being created in the atmosphere by an interaction of cosmic rays, sun, with atmospheric nitrogen. The resulting carbon-14 combines with atmospheric oxygen, and that forms radioactive carbon dioxide. Not the kind of carbon dioxide you breathe out, but radioactive carbon dioxide, which is incorporated into plants, right? They'll take it in the same as they take in the carbon dioxide that you exhale. They take that in, and then they use photosynthesis to turn that into energy. Animals then acquire that carbon-14 by eating the plants. When an animal or a plant dies, it stops exchanging carbon with its environment when it dies. And from that point onward, the amount of C14 it contains begins to decrease as the C14 undergoes radioactive decay. This is important. This is the basis for all of radiocarbon dating. Measuring the amount of C14 in a sample from a dead plant or a dead animal, such as a piece of wood, right, or a fragment of bone, like a fossil, provides information that can then be used to calculate when an animal or plant died. And I'll explain how here in just a second. The older a sample is, the less C14 there is to be detected, because the half-life of carbon-14, which is the period of time that a sample breaks down into half of what it originally was, the amount of time it takes for a given sample to decay, is about 5,730 years. So this is how we age things. This is how we can date something like dinosaur bones. We use a similar method for dating rocks. But let's say we find a rock, and we want to know how old that thing is. We decide to analyze the rock by looking for certain elements or compounds which break down over time and into certain other elements or compounds, right? Basic science, chemistry at this point, we know this will break down and become this. We might, for example, look for a special isotope of uranium and the element that it eventually breaks down or decays into, which would be lead. In our rock specimen, we find some of the special uranium and some of the lead that it decays into, and that we call the daughter element. The thing that it decays into, in this case the lead, is the daughter element. And it's called a daughter element because it breaks down from the mother element, the uranium. We can measure how much lead is in the rock because we think we know how fast or how slowly uranium decays down and breaks down into lead. If that's the case, then the amount of lead in the rock should then be able to tell us how old it is, if we know that uranium breaks down at a fixed rate, right? Basic math. In other words, the amount of lead present in the rock would have resulted from a certain amount of uranium decaying over a certain number of years into the lead. Okay? Follow me? For all of this to yield a specific time frame in millions or billions of years, certain assumptions have to be made. And we need to discuss the assumptions. I mentioned this a few weeks back. The buzzword's going to be what assumptions? What are your assumptions? What are you assuming? Because you're assuming certain things to be true in order to make these calculations, so what are you assuming? We need to know what the assumptions are if we're going to use these dating techniques, and then take that into consideration when we're weighing the evidence. So the assumptions that radiocarbon dating are based on is that there's no daughter component. Follow me. It must be assumed that the original sample contained 0 daughter elements to begin with, right? So in the case of uranium and lead, whatever rock you look at could have no lead in it to start with, only uranium, right? That's an assumption. And keep in mind, this is something that I remind people of frequently. We have to keep this in mind. Yes, lead exists. It's on the periodic table of elements. And yes, uranium exists. It's on the periodic table of elements. We know that uranium decays down into lead, right? But that doesn't mean that all lead comes from uranium. In the exact same way that, okay, you can make polyvinyl chloride, right? PVC. You can make PVC pipes. You can make all of this stuff without necessarily going through the same parent element process. In other words, there are many ways of getting to the final product, right? It's like cooking. Sometimes you start with the eggs first. Sometimes you start with the flour first. But eventually you'll still end up with whatever it is you're trying to make. And there are multiple roads to Rome, so to speak. There's not only one set way. That's important to keep that in mind as well. So if we're assuming that there is no daughter element in the original sample in the beginning of whatever time period we're looking at, then it's a simple equation of math. It's a simple mathematic calculation that makes it very simple. But if it contained any daughter element at all at the start, the calculation becomes impossible without knowing the quantity of the daughter element first. In this case, lead. If I don't know how much lead it started with, it's too many variables to count. You can't calculate it. It's mathematically impossible. So you can't solve for two unknown variables at the exact same time when you're dealing with chemical components. That doesn't make sense. You cannot do that without having at least one known factor first. I'll give you an example, because a lot of this is going to be very science heavy, math heavy. So if you're not looking to fully understand it in the way that I had to understand it, I get it, I understand, click off and come back in a few weeks. This may cause you to glaze over a little bit. That's fine. It's completely fine. Feel free to pause and try to wrap your head around some of this as I go. This took me 4 years of intense study as a neuroscientist to really grasp and understand and come to terms with what all of this meant. So, an example. I have a handful of change, right? And say that I give you 2 quarters. How much money do you have? That's easy. It's 50 cents. Like, this is basic math. Yes, it is. And it's not going to get much more complicated than basic math. You have 50 cents. Now, how much money do I have left? You have no idea, because you have no idea how much money I started with, right? I have a handful of change. You can't solve those two. That's not possible. You're guessing that whatever I have is 50 cents less because I gave you 50 cents, but you can't possibly know how much money I have to start with. That's what we're talking about when we say you can't possibly know how much lead there was to start with or how much uranium there was to start with. You can only see it in its current state and math it backwards. Now, what if I were to say I give you 50 cents every Wednesday? Every day, like every Wednesday, I'm giving you 50 cents. And to date, you've collected $1.50 from me. How many weeks have gone by? 3 weeks. Easy. We can calculate that. Again, how much money do I have left? You've got no way of knowing that. This is the problem we run into with radiocarbon dating and dating geological formations. You have no way of knowing how much they start with. And you're assuming that I haven't made any money in those 3 weeks. Right? These are things that we're assuming in this hypothetical situation where I'm giving you 50 cents every week for 3 weeks. You have no idea how much money I started with. You have no way of telling if I've made any new money in the 3 weeks since we started this little project. And you also don't know whether or not my income has fluctuated over time. And I'm not earning money at a set rate. The same problem applies to radiocarbon dating, carbon C14 into C12. The same problem exists. You have no idea of knowing how much carbon was in there in the beginning. You have no idea if it fluctuated over time. And you have no idea if any new carbon-14 was created since the beginning of that sample's life. For rocks, you're assuming that rock originally had no lead in it whatsoever, at all. That is a mandated assumption for any of the calculations to be performed. Based on our evidence, we have no evidence. Okay, we have no evidence to support that claim whatsoever. We don't. It's actually counterproductive to make that claim. So we don't make the claim, we just make it an assumption, and we don't talk about it. This is how this works. So, side note, and this is an important side note. Okay. Hypothetically, let's say you were to take a sample of like Adam's leg from Genesis to try to determine how old he is, and you took it on the day he was created, first 5 minutes, whatever, and you take it immediately and you carbon date it. How old would carbon dating say that Adam was? Thousands of years old. At least. Thousands of years old. Because in order for you to calculate that, it would at least be 50,000 years old, radiocarbon dating it. He wouldn't have eaten any carbon-containing plants at all at this point, right before his first meal. There's no carbon in him. No radioactive carbon decaying that he's eaten. So if there's no carbon-14 left, he's at least 50,000 years old. there are so many problems of radiocarbon dating. And this is why I feel like, okay, Stephen Hawking said it best when he said that, if we're dealing in hundreds or maybe a few thousand years, radiocarbon dating is helpful. But on an evolutionary time scale, when we're trying to justify Darwinian evolution, you cannot use radiocarbon dating. Now, what did I say at the very beginning of this about radiocarbon dating? It's the most reliable method that we have. And it sucks. It's only good on a small scale. You can't expound it and extrapolate it out to millions of years when the math is only possible up to 50,000 years. The second assumption that we don't talk about is that this requires you to have an isolated system. Understand what I mean by that. In order for any dating method to be accurate, any dating method whatsoever, you have to assume that there's zero contamination of whatever sample it is over time. Zero. Perfectly controlled, isolated system. Meaning it would have to be closed to the elements, to fluctuations in temperature, to fluctuations in weather, to any kind of outside contamination, any external influence on that sample whatsoever the entire time it was in the ground. We know that's physically impossible, right? Because fluids pour over these samples all the time. Water falls, and rain, acid rain, whatever. You end up with sample contamination all the time. I mean, by definition, would you trust your surgeon to dig up a scalpel out of the dirt and cut you open with it? No, you want it to be sterile. You want it to be controlled and clean for that exact same reason. If there's no control and it's literally contaminated constantly, it's not wise. That's not an accurate depiction of the math that we're attempting to do, improving the Earth to be 4.3 or 4.83 billion years old or whatever we've come up with at this point. The dates keep changing. The whole setup is highly unreliable, and we don't talk about that from a scientific perspective in the scientific community. We don't tell your kids that when we're teaching them that in academia. We just don't mention these assumptions at all because we have no answer for them. So you end up graduating with a degree in neurobiology and thinking you know at least a little bit about how the world works and how it was formed and everything else, and not realizing whatsoever the massive disconnect between what you've been taught and if you would just stop and think about what you've been taught. Common sense. Common sense says this is not possible. And not even just common sense. It's literally a violation of the scientific method to apply these techniques to dating the world to be billions of years old. Anyway, the third assumption that we don't talk about is that it's assuming that radiocarbon dating, so radioactive carbon, decays at a very constant rate, or the uranium decays at a very constant rate, unchanging. It has to be a constant. It's part of the equation. It has to be a constant. Cannot fluctuate. That cannot be a variable. If that's a variable in the equation, then the whole equation's garbage. Well, guess what? We can't say that carbon has been constant for all of time. The decay rates of carbon, the decay rates of uranium. We can't. Because in order for it to be constant, you can have no fluctuation in temperature. You can have no fluctuation in the conditions that they're exposed to. It has to be in a vacuum at a very constant temperature in order to get a constant decay rate. The weather here, where I'm at, was 103 degrees yesterday. 101, something stupid. Today it was 85. Tomorrow will be like 79. It fluctuates. And we can't deny the fact that the temperature fluctuates. Everybody knows this. But the fact that it fluctuates is exactly why you can't assume a constant decay rate, because elements decay at varying rates dependent upon the temperature and the conditions they are exposed to. We know this. Scientifically, we know this. We can prove that in a lab following the scientific method of what's observable and repeatable. Let me give you an example. You walk into a room and you see a candle burning. It's burning on the table. Assuming you can measure how fast it's currently burning, right? You could calculate, theoretically, how long it's been burning, right? If you walk in, you see a candle burning and you see, okay, and you watch it for an hour and it burns 1 inch down. You assume you can calculate back how tall it was and how long it's been burning. Problem is, you actually don't know how tall it was to start with. Can't do that. And yes, you might be able to get somewhere in the ballpark of how long it's been burning, but it can be wildly inaccurate as well, because you're assuming that candles burn at very constant rates, and there's no wind to speed up the burning process. You need to know how tall it was to begin with. You need to know at least the variables that you don't know. Only if you know how tall that candle was to begin with can you even begin to start doing any calculations. Otherwise, you're stuck with 2 unknown variables, and now it's an impossible calculation. So what if we give you that one, right? What if I say it was 8 inches tall? Now it's 5 inches tall. You see that it's burning over the course of the hour. You observe it at 1 inch an hour. It's been burning for 3 hours, right? You can do that math. Assuming it burns at the same rate. Constantly. Never changes, never fluctuates, and it's in an isolated closed system with no external influence, any external variables. But what if a draft blew through there and sped up the burning process? That's a possibility, right? What if that breeze triples its burn rate? Can you calculate it now? Oh, you would need to know what kind of breeze passed through. You can't do that. You weren't there. We weren't there to watch it. We weren't there to measure it. So it's a variable that'll be forever unknown. You can't do the calculation now. Now all you can do is guess. Yeah. You have to ignore all of these variables in real life in order to make a calculation. That's what we do in science. And that's where we get the answers we want to get, by assuming everything was controlled from the very beginning. Constant. No temperature changes. Now, if you read a biology textbook, you'll see the very first thing they talk about is that the Earth was completely different then. Oh, the temperatures were wildly variable. The conditions were crazy. And we ignore that and say, well, we used carbon dating to prove this fossil to be 20 million years old. That makes no sense. So, carbon-12, in order for carbon dating, right, you have to assume the following things to be true. You have to assume that carbon-12 never existed at all until the very first carbon-14 molecule decayed into carbon-12, its more stable form. No outside contamination ever affected that bone or that specimen or that fossil. The amount of carbon in the atmosphere remained constant. You have to assume that it remained constant since day one of creation. Something that even an atheist scientist will admit is not true. Because we can prove that today. We see the variation in carbon in every single sample we look at. And if we're seeing a variation in the amount of carbon, we know it's not stable. It's not possible. And the decay rate of carbon-14 into carbon-12, you have to assume it never fluctuated whatsoever, which we in fact know temperature, pressure, radiation, many other factors affect carbon decay rate. Remember, this is the most reliable method of dating we have. Okay, so now we have some problems that this poses. If the Earth is older than 50,000 years old, there should be zero observable carbon-14 in any sample we look at, ever, at all. Period. But we claim that diamonds are millions of years old, but we cannot explain, or rather choose not to, why carbon-14 is observed in every sample of diamond ever tested. Or why we can find it in samples of coal. What about when we find it in samples of fossilized bones? After 50,000 years, we don't have the ability to measure any remaining carbon-14. Yet it's there, and it's measurable every time. So what about soft tissues? We need to talk about soft tissues. This is important. It's all important. But this is something we don't talk about much. Dr. Mary Schweitzer at North Carolina State University in Raleigh, North Carolina, is a different kind of paleontologist. And she's the kind that likes to approach her research kind of out of the box, different way. This paleontologist, Dr. Mary Schweitzer, she went to Montana several years back, and she helped to unearth one of the largest, most well-preserved T-Rex skeletons in Montana to date. In doing so, one of the leg bones was over 2,000 pounds, far exceeding the capacity of her helicopter to transport it back, her and her team. So they did what people rarely do when they find big bones like this, particularly ones where a museum would pay upwards of $2 million for. They broke it in half. They set about cutting this sucker in half. A 2,000-pound T-Rex leg bone. That is something no one ever really does. But it posed an interesting opportunity. You ever break a bone in half, or anything of that matter, pick up a cracker, something really dry, and break it. It produces a lot of crumbs. Saw through a piece of wood, you get sawdust, right? This gave her team and her an opportunity to look inside for one of the first times. Because up to this point, most bones you see, okay, back up. Went on vacation, went to Georgia, Atlanta Science Center, took the kids there for a day. Awesome. Huge skeletons, huge representations of these dinosaurs. And they're great. And the first one you walk in was it like Brontosaurus, right? Vegisaurus from Jurassic Park, which we now admit was completely fabricated based off of two completely different animals we thought were bones, even though they were all the way across the world. We thought, oh, these go together. And then we made it up. And then an artist came up with this rendering of the big long neck Vegisaurus. You won't find that in a science textbook today. We've taken that one out. That actually doesn't exist anymore. That's one of the few where science went, okay, we were wrong. Yep. The majority of the bones you see, well, first of all, if you go in, it's not going to be out on display. Those are plaster casts of the bones, or what they think they should look like. The majority of these skeletons are not complete skeletons. It's a femur, it may be a jawbone and a rib, and they come up with the rest. The problem with that, when you do find a complete skeleton, one of the few, like this T-Rex, right? One of the most well-preserved complete skeletons we had. You can't carry it back. So they chop it up, and then Mary and her team set about going, okay, well, we do research differently. What's something no one's ever really done before? Let's take it back to the microbiology lab. Most paleontologists have nothing to do with microbiology. They dig in the dirt. They don't want to be messing with slides and microscopes. And she takes a few slices, these thin slices of this bone, and she puts it on a microscope. And that's something no one's ever done before. She was the first one to do this. She takes it and looks through the microscope, and she sees tiny red circular discs. Immediately identifiable what they are. Anyone who's looked at a microscope in a microbiology lab, this is one of your first intro to biology experiments, right? When you're learning lab 101, is you take a drop of your blood or tissues and you look at it, and the little circular red discs are red blood cells. That was in 2005. This is not ancient discovery. This is 2005 when Dr. Mary and her team find red blood cells in a fossilized T-Rex leg bone. Upon further investigation, though, she decides to soak this fragment in acid for 3 days because it's the kind of acid that will dissolve any kind of bone, whether it's fossilized or whether it's brand new bone. It doesn't matter. Bone, it will be dissolved by acid. And what's left, she was curious, what would be left from a fossilized T-Rex bone that's 60 million years old if we dissolve all the bone? Well, guess what she finds? Stretchy, elastic, soft tissues, blood vessels. The fact that blood vessels were still stretchy and elastic, this rocked the science world. She got a lot of heat for publishing and saying that she found red blood cells and still stretchy and elastic blood vessels in a fossilized T-Rex bone, because that flies into the face of all of what we know up to this point about biology. Red blood cells don't last that long. Blood vessels won't be stretchy and elastic after 60 million years. We know this because they don't last that long. So other scientists started telling her, instead of looking for evidence that that's what they are, red blood cells, right? Start looking for evidence that that's what they're not. So she continued her research, but she found the vast capillary tissues and blood vessels perfectly intact. And then she discovered the presence of heme in them. Now, heme is a component of hemoglobin. What's in your blood? Red blood cells were precisely what they were. Even more confusing, she found proteins and collagen bands, and there's no denying her research. She was a renowned paleontologist, and she followed the scientific method. It is observable. It was repeatable. There's no denying it. So we just don't talk about it. We're going to ignore that fact that we're claiming something is 68 million years old and still has red blood cells identifiable in it. And yet the scientific community still holds tight to their claim that it's a 68 million year old T-Rex. Why? Well, everyone knows. This was the reason given. Everyone knows that it is firmly established that the Hell Creek Formation, which is where they found the bones, is 68 million years old. Okay, even if that is the case, then the same claim can be made about everybody buried in a cemetery. Just because the dirt's that old still doesn't mean that the bones are that old. So this notion that fossils are stone, right? Bones that are fossilized through a process that converts the bone into stones, basically stone component, completely gets turned on its head. Dr. Mary Schweitzer said in 2017, I don't know what the definition is anymore. You ask, what's a fossil? She says, I don't know what the definition is anymore. And that's what a lot of scientists find themselves saying. We thought it was when bones turn into stone, but that's not possible. If you're finding heme and hemoglobin, red blood cells, proteins, collagen bands, soft tissues in these samples, that's not what it is then. And it doesn't take millions of years. This is another misconception. It does not take millions of years to make a fossil. I give you an example because it only takes hours to days, and we know this. We have proof of this. There was a human fossil found out west of a man's leg, a leg bone, still in his cowboy boot. It does not take millions of years to fossilize a bone. It takes hours to days. So you can't even use that argument of we know that they're 68 million years old. And maybe it was just this one random sample and it's a one-off thing. Well, now that she did this with this one, this started kind of an entire avenue of research. Her and her team found the same thing present in a so-called 80 million year old hadrosaur. Other teams found the same thing when they looked at what was previously thought to be a 247 million year old reptile, a 550 million year old beard worm, a 417 million year old arthropod. It's everywhere. Dr. Schweitzer, who continues to be one of the leading researchers in dinosaur tissues, concludes that we have, quote, two alternatives for interpretation. Either the dinosaurs aren't as old as we think they are, or maybe we don't know exactly how these things get preserved. Fair enough. The problem is that the scientific community does not want to even consider the first alternative as a possibility. Thus, it's not really an either-or kind of option, right? In our view, the fossils must be old. Therefore, the tissue must have somehow survived. We just can't explain it. So we don't talk about it. So if dinosaurs are not as old as we think they are, did they coexist with humans? That begs the question, right? If we carbon date things to millions and billions of years old, and if all of that's based on assumptions that make it completely trash, and you throw out carbon dating, you throw out geological formation, the most reliable methods we have, it brings into question the age of everything. And if you don't know the age of everything, or anything for that matter, then anything's possible for the age of the Earth, the age of these fossils that we're seeing, if they're not as old as we think they are, because red blood cells would not be found in something that was older than 5,000 to 6,000 years old. That's the current scientific consensus. That's why they got so upset when her research was published in peer-reviewed journals that soft tissues and red blood cells were found. It refutes Darwinian theory. It refutes the age of the Earth. But if you read Genesis, the age of the Earth is about 10,000 years or less. So, did dinosaurs coexist with humans? This is a question. Does the Bible say anything about dinosaurs? I've heard even preachers say, no, dinosaurs weren't in the Bible. They're just big bones of something else. Flip over to Job chapter 40. I'm going to prove y'all wrong right now. Job chapter 40. I'm going to read from the NIV. Verse 1. The Lord said to Job, will the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? Let him who accuses God answer him. Then Job answered the Lord, I am unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more. Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. This is one of my favorite parts as we get into, if you ever study Job, the questions. He's bombarding God with questions. And eventually he gets an answer in the form of, I think it's 57 or so questions that God answers him out of this whirlwind. The most questions ever asked of any human by God recorded. And he says, the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. Brace yourself like a man. Right? King James will say, gird up thyself like a man. as if you're going to battle. Like, put your big boy pants on. Brace yourself like a man. I will question you and you shall answer me. Would you discredit my justice? Would you condemn me to justify yourself? Do you have an arm like God's? And can your voice thunder like his? Then adorn yourself with glory and splendor and clothe yourself and honor and majesty. Unleash the fury of your wrath. Look at all who are proud and bring them low. Look at all who are proud and humble them. Crush the wicked where they stand. Verse 13, bury them all in the dust together, shroud their faces in the grave. Then I myself will admit to you that your own right hand can save you. Verse 15, God says, look at Behemoth, which I made along with you. This is one of the few animals, one of two, that God gives a name to. The other one's also in Job, and we're going to get to that immediately after this one. But he says, look at Behemoth, which I made along with you, and which feeds on grass like an ox. What strength it has in its loins, what power in the muscles of its belly. Its tail sways like a cedar. The sinews of its thighs are close knit. Its bones are tubes of bronze. Its limbs like rods of iron. It ranks first among the works of God, yet its maker can approach it with his sword. The hills bring it their produce, and all the wild animals play nearby. Under the lotus plant it lies, hidden among the reeds in the marsh. The lotuses conceal it in their shadow, and the poplars by the stream surround it. A raging river does not alarm it. It is secure, though the Jordan should surge against its mouth. Can anyone capture it by the eyes or trap it and pierce its nose? What is God describing here? Something with limbs like iron and bones like bronze? This massive animal that can basically draw up the Jordan in its mouth? Interesting. Verse 1 of chapter 41. He says, can you pull in Leviathan with a fishhook? So we have a land animal that's massive and terrifying, being described in Behemoth. And then he immediately goes into describing this aquatic life that also he gives a name to, Leviathan. Can you pull in Leviathan with a fishhook, or tie down its tongue with a rope? Can you put a cord through its nose or pierce its jaw with a hook? Will it keep begging you for mercy? Will it speak to you with gentle words? Will it make an agreement with you for you to take it as your slave for life? Can you make a pet of it like a bird? Or put it on a leash for the young women in your house? Will traders barter for it? Will they divide it up among the merchants? Can you fill its hide with harpoons? So not only is this thing massive, you can't even fill its hide with harpoons. What? Or its head with fishing spears? If you lay a hand on it, you will remember the struggle and never do it again. Any hope of subduing it is false. The mere sight of it is overpowering. No one is fierce enough to rouse it. Who then is able to stand against me, the one who created it? Who has a claim against me that I must pay? Everything under heaven belongs to me. I will not fail to speak of Leviathan's limbs, its strength, and its graceful form. Who can strip off its outer coat? Who can penetrate its double coat of armor? Who dares open the doors of its mouth, ringed about with fearsome teeth? Its back has rows of shields, tightly sealed together, like scales, right? Each is so close to the next that no air can pass between. They are joined fast to one another, and they cling together and cannot be parted. Its snorting throws out flashes of light. Its eyes are like the rays of dawn. Flames stream from its mouth, sparks of fire shoot out. Wait, we're not talking about a big fish. We're talking about something with scales like iron you cannot pierce, that breathes fire. Smoke pours from its nostrils as from a boiling pot over burning reeds. Its breath sets coals ablaze. Its breath sets coals ablaze? It's a freaking dragon! And flames dart from its mouth. Strength resides in its neck. Dismay goes before it. Verse 23, The folds of its flesh are tightly joined. They are firm and immovable. Its chest is hard as rock, hard as a lower millstone. When it rises up, the mighty are terrified. They retreat before its thrashing. The sword that reaches it has no effect, nor does the spear or the dart or the javelin. Iron it treats like straw, and bronze like rotten wood. Arrows do not make it flee. Sling stones are like chaff to it. A club seems to it but a piece of straw. It laughs at the rattling of a lance. Its undersides are jagged potsherds, leaving a trail in the mud, like a threshing sledge. It makes the depths churn like a boiling cauldron and stirs up the sea like a pot of ointment. It leaves a glistening wake behind it. One would think the deep had white hair. Nothing on earth is its equal. A creature without fear. It looks down on all that are haughty. It is king over all that are proud. Obviously, these animals existed. If God told Job, "Behold, look at it," that means he could see it. Like, look at him. He's huge, fearless, not afraid of anything, terrifying. The chief of the ways of God. But they have sharp teeth. So they had to be carnivores, right? This says he eats grass like an ox. We have to be careful here. This is another thing that we teach elementary school kids in biology that's just not, it's just plain wrong. It's not true. Things with sharp teeth eat meat. No. Pandas have sharp teeth. Feed them meat, they'll get deathly ill. That doesn't even make sense. Fruit bats have sharp teeth. They don't eat meat. You eat meat, you don't have sharp teeth. We gotta stop lying to everyone in science. This doesn't... Fruit bats are vegetarian. So are pandas, which are freaking bears, okay? You can't just use the argument that, oh, they have sharp teeth, they must have been carnivores. Important to realize this because we think, oh, well, they would have eaten each other and everything. Do we realize, have you read your Bible, Genesis? Meat wasn't even permitted to be eaten in the beginning. Everything had to be vegetarian, according to Genesis. If you don't believe that, you don't believe the Bible, not my problem. I'll prove it. Genesis chapter 1, verse 29. Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds of the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. But then after the flood, we see a verse, and it's important because after the flood occurs, what we see in chapter 9 of Genesis, verses 1 through 3, it says, Then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. The fear and dread of you will fall on all the beasts of the earth and all the birds of the sky, on every creature that moves along the ground and all the fish in the sea. They are given into your hands. Everything that lives and moves about will be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything. It wasn't until chapter 9 after the flood that eating meat was even permitted. Everything had to be vegetarian. And God literally said, everything eats green plants. So do we ever wonder where these myths of fire-breathing dragons ever come from? Game of Thrones, everything's got these fire-breathing dragons. All these different legends that exist in all these different cultures all around the world throughout all of history. So over 3,000 cultural references to fire-breathing reptiles or fire-breathing serpents, flying, fire-breathing dragons. And we have to remember, at the time that these are, we have cave drawings of these things. At the time they existed, they didn't communicate with cultures in Asia, and they didn't communicate with the cultures in South America. there was no internet and Wi-Fi. Okay, they didn't even know like these other cultures existed. I highly doubt they came up with this fantastical creature all the same. There's way too much evidence for the actual existence of fire-breathing dragons. And you might think I'm crazy, but do the research on it. It'll blow your mind. And okay. I stop at fire-breathing dragons. I'm not a flat earther, okay? I don't believe in like stupid stuff. But the stuff where there's actual evidence to support the fact that we just can't see it now doesn't mean that it didn't exist then. And we need to keep that in mind, okay? We even see this in Jeremiah. So it's freaking biblical. Track with me here. Jeremiah chapter 51. I'll read you the King James Version. Okay, let's go old school because the words that we translated matter. Jeremiah 51:34. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, hath devoured me. He hath crushed me. He hath made me an empty vessel. He hath swallowed me up like a dragon. He hath filled his belly with my delicates. He hath cast me out. The word that we translate as dragon in the King James English was the Hebrew word tinian, which means dragon, serpent, sea monster. Today, we would say dinosaur. Okay? Now, understand why. That's a word that was coined in 1841, which means terrible lizard. And it comes from the Greek dainos, meaning terrible, and the Greek word sauros, meaning lizard. But it wasn't even created as a word until 1841. So, no, you're not going to see the word dinosaur in a Bible that was translated in 1611. Or even anything older than 1841, you would never see dinosaur. But we're talking about the same animals. It's just a difference between Greek and Hebrew in King James English. The word we use today that was coined by Richard Owen to describe a large reptile skeleton he discovered is dinosaur. I find it very hard to believe that the entire history of the world, all these different cultures, all came up with the same description of this fantastical creature that could breathe fire, fly, had impenetrable scales, that ravaged villages, and they never communicated with one another about it. Isaiah 30, verse 6, KJV says, "The burden of the beasts of the south, into the land of trouble and anguish, from whence came the young and the old lion, the viper, and the fiery flying serpent." Fiery flying serpents. So people laugh, right? People laugh when I point them to the actual evidence of fiery flying serpents, as described in Isaiah 30, verse 6 here. But the fact remains, whether you call it a dinosaur, a dragon, a serpent, whatever word you choose to use to describe this now extinct animal, millions of people over the past several thousand years describe seeing them. They describe hunting them. They describe living among them. The Chinese even have records describing how they would hunt them and which parts of the body were used for medicinal purposes versus which parts were eaten as a delicacy. Yeah, dragons. Freaking dragons. Dinosaurs, Leviathan, Behemoth, all existed. Absolutely. They walked among us and since have gone extinct. Just like the passenger pigeon, just like the western black rhinoceros, just like the Tasmanian tiger and the freaking dodo bird. Things going extinct is nothing new. It's only in recent history that we've started to try to convince our children that these are fairy tales and make-believe and just television. You know, it's a good TV show, but it's not real. It was freaking real for the people living with these animals. The idea of a fire-breathing animal sounds like nonsense today. I get it, but I would side with you on that one if you could show me that we have no evidence whatsoever in any animal on the planet. Like if we didn't have examples of this even being feasible, biologically possible to breathe fire, then I would agree with you. But we have the Bombardier Beetle, and we need to talk about the Bombardier Beetle on multiple fronts. This is a key example on multiple points of Darwinian evolution. But it's also a great example of, fire-breathing animals is freaking possible. It is. The Bombardier Beetle is a ground beetle, right? It's found on every continent in the planet except for Antarctica. And it's most notable for its defense mechanism. So when it's disturbed or feels threatened, it ejects this hot, noxious gas, this chemical spray, from the tip of its abdomen with like a popping sound. It's like poof. The spray that's produced by this beetle is a reaction between hydroquinone and hydrogen peroxide. The spray that is produced from this reaction between these two chemical compounds, hydroquinone and hydrogen peroxide, which are stored in two reservoirs in the beetle's abdomen. When the aqueous solution of hydroquinones and hydrogen peroxide reaches the vestibule, catalysts facilitate this decomposition of the hydrogen peroxide and then the oxidation of hydroquinone. Heat from the reaction brings this mixture to near the boiling point of water, and it produces a gas that drives the ejection. The damage caused by this to an attacking predator, insect, can be fatal. Some of these Bombardier beetles can direct the spray like a turret gun in a wide range of directions. So we have a beetle who combines two chemical solutions to produce a hot, fatal, gas-driven chemical explosion into the face of its predator. The biology checks out. The idea of something similar existing in the nostrils of a large reptile to where it could spray out and create a fire. It's biologically possible, and it checks out. We have examples of this, and something else we should point to, the Bombardier beetle is also a great example of irreducible complexity. When you're talking about Darwinian evolution, small, tiny changes, mutations in the DNA, lead to some beneficial trait later on down the line of its offspring. That becomes a problem because we know the entire DNA, we know the entire the genome of the Bombardier beetle has been mapped. We know that if you change any single one of these building blocks that build this defense mechanism, you do not get a beneficial change. Not only that, you cannot have any mutation or defect in these two reservoirs because literally it's irreducibly complex. You cannot break it down any further. If there's any defect at all, the freaking beetle explodes, okay? So you can't have a little change being passed down and the offspring has another little change to get two violently reactive chemical compounds stored in two separate reservoirs that can eject out through a nozzle that can be directed and turned with an exploding hot force. Like, that beetle doesn't go on to have any offspring, right? It just... dead beetle. Dead beetles don't produce. That's a Darwinian problem. So, this entire system of mixing these potent chemicals has to come into existence together all at once in its entirety with such specificity that it cannot be explained by evolutionary theory. So yeah, dinosaurs are biblical. Dragons are biblical. Both are scientifically and historically documented. And you've been lied to about everything concerning fossils. How accurate the dating methods are, how long it takes for them to form, even the processes by which they form. All of that's under current scientific scrutiny, and it's changing every day. More scientific evidence exists to refute this million-year-old animals idea than support it. But without millions of years, Darwinian theory dies on its face. Atheists won't tolerate that. Atheists won't tolerate that. They won't tolerate the scientific field following the actual evidence to its natural conclusion, because they must and will defend their religion violently. And that's what it is. It's not science. It's a religion. When we come to terms with whatever we can't observe and we make claims about is religion, then we're on the same page. Then we can follow the evidence and discuss it. So at the end of the day, follow where the evidence leads. I've kept you guys for over an hour now. I'll let you go, and in the next video, I'm going to dig into more of the geological halos, radioisotope halos, because that'll blow your freaking mind. I love you guys. I'll see you all next time.